On September 12, 1883, Lars Eriksson began digging a hole 8 feet deep and 16 feet square, approximately 40 yards behind his barn in what would become Fergus County, Montana Territory, and by the time his nearest neighbor noticed what he was doing. 3 days later, the pile of excavated earth stood nearly as tall as a man. By the end of that week, every homesteader within 10 miles had heard about the Norwegian who was wasting the last decent weather of the season, digging what looked like a grave for a giant, instead of cutting firewood for the winter that was already showing itself in the morning frost. The reaction was not subtle. Thomas McKendrick, 61, who had survived 7 Montana winters and considered this qualification enough to judge any man's preparations, rode over on September 19th and stood at the edge of the pit, watching Lars work. "You planning to store potatoes in there?" McKendrick asked. "Firewood," Lars said, not stopping his work. McKendrick laughed, the sound carrying across the empty grassland. "Son, firewood goes in a woodshed, above ground, where you can get to it when the snow's 6 feet deep and you're burning through half a cord every 3 days just to keep from freezing to death in your own house." Lars straightened, leaned on his shovel. "That is why I am putting it where the snow cannot reach it," he said. His English still carried the angular rhythm of Norwegian, each word deliberate. McKendrick shook his head and rode off, and by evening, the story had reached the settlement at Lewistown, where it provoked considerable discussion at Broadwater's store. The consensus was clear: the Norwegian had misunderstood something fundamental about Montana winters, probably because wherever he came from had weather that bore no resemblance to what was coming. Lars Eriksson was 34 years old, had been in Montana Territory for 14 months, and had spent the previous winter in a boarding house in Helena, where he worked at a lumber mill and listened carefully to every conversation about survival on the open prairie. He was not misunderstanding anything. He was remembering. Specifically, he was remembering his grandfather's farm outside Lillehammer, where winter temperatures regularly dropped to 20 below zero and stayed there for weeks, and where firewood was stored in a structure built half into the hillside with a sod roof and walls thick enough that the wood inside stayed dry, regardless of how much snow fell or how long it stayed. The principle was straightforward enough that a child could understand it. Build your storage below the frost line, insulate it properly, and provide adequate drainage, and the temperature inside would remain relatively constant while the world above froze and thawed and froze again. The wood would stay dry because no snow or rain could reach it, and it would remain accessible because you could walk through a tunnel entrance rather than climb over or dig through drifts that might be over your head. Lars had tried to explain this to the land agent in Helena who had sold him his homestead claim, but the man had waved him off. "We do things different here," the agent said. "This isn't Norway." Which was true enough, but Lars had noticed that the basic principles of physics and moisture and temperature seemed to operate the same way in Montana as they did in Scandinavia, and he was willing to bet his winter survival on that observation. The excavation took 11 days working alone, which was longer than he had hoped, but shorter than he had feared, given that he hit a layer of rock at 6 feet that required 2 full days of careful work with a pry bar to remove in pieces small enough to haul out. By September 23rd, he had the pit completed, 8 feet deep, 16 feet long, 14 feet wide, with one wall sloped at a gentle angle that would eventually become the entry ramp. The floor was as level as he could make it with hand tools, and he had trenched a drainage channel that ran from the lowest corner out toward the creek, angled at what he estimated to be a 1-inch drop per 8 feet of distance. Mary Catherine Brennan, whose husband had died the previous winter and who was now running their homestead with help from her brother, rode over on September 24th, leading a mule loaded with cut hay she was selling to anyone who needed it. She stopped and looked at the hole and the massive pile of dirt beside it. "Mr. Eriksson," she said, "are you building a root cellar?" "For firewood," he said. She was quiet for a long moment. "Firewood," she repeated. "Yes, ma'am." "Root cellars are for vegetables, for potatoes and carrots and turnips, things that need to stay cold but not freeze. Firewood just needs to stay dry, and for that you build a shed with a roof, with walls, above the ground where you can reach it." She was not unkind in her tone, more concerned than mocking, but the message was the same as McKendrick's. "You are doing this wrong." Lars nodded politely. "I understand that is the usual method. I am trying something different." Different how? In Norway, we sometimes store firewood underground. It stays very dry, no snow on it ever. Mary Catherine looked at the hole, at the pile of dirt, at Lars, who was covered in dust and clearly exhausted. Mr. Erickson, with respect, this isn't Norway. Our winters are different. The snow here is different. And if you put your firewood in a hole in the ground, how exactly do you plan to get to it when there's a blizzard and you can't see your hand in front of your face? I will walk down, he said simply, and pointed to the sloped wall. A ramp, covered. I will be able to walk in any weather. She shook her head slowly, not in disagreement, but in something closer to resignation. Well, she said, I hope you're right. I truly do. But I've seen 3 winters here, and I've learned that the old ways are old for a reason. She sold him the hay, he needed it for his 2 oxen and the milk cow, and rode off, and Lars went back to work. The construction phase began on September 26th and immediately presented problems that Lars had anticipated, but which still required careful solutions. The roof structure needed to support not just its own weight, but potentially several feet of snow and the soil that would cover it, which meant he needed timber substantial enough for that load. He had purchased 12 oak beams in Helena before leaving, each one 8 inches square and 18 feet long, transported at considerable expense on a freight wagon, and these now lay beside his barn, waiting for this exact purpose. He also had 24 rough-cut pine planks, each 12 feet long and 2 inches thick, and approximately 900 individual pieces of split pine that he had bought from a sawmill operation near Fort Benton. The beams would span the width of the pit. The planks would lay perpendicular across the beams, and the splits would form a layer of wood over the planks before the whole thing was covered with the canvas tarp he had brought from Norway, and finally, with 2 feet of soil. The insulation value of earth was something he had seen demonstrated many times. His grandfather's storage structure maintained a temperature of approximately 45 degrees year-round, never freezing even when the air temperature was 30 below, never warm enough to cause moisture problems in summer. On September 27th, James and Robert Hendricks, brothers who ran a cattle operation 6 miles south, stopped by and found Lars attempting to position the first beam across the pit using a rope system and his 2 oxen. "Need a hand?" James asked. Lars straightened, surprised. "I would be grateful," he said. The 3 of them worked for the better part of 2 hours getting the first beam positioned correctly, level and square, its ends resting on the original ground surface on either side of the pit. When it was secure, Robert stood back and looked at the structure beginning to take shape. "So, you're really doing this," he said, "building a firewood cellar." "Yes," Lars said. "Why?" Robert asked. It was not hostile, just genuinely curious. Lars explained about Norway, about underground storage, about consistent temperatures and dry wood, and accessibility during storms. The brothers listened, and when he finished, James shook his head. "Problem is," James said, "firewood needs air circulation to stay dry. You put it in a hole in the ground and cover it up, you're going to get condensation, moisture, rot. By January, you'll be trying to burn wood that's wetter than when it was a living tree." "That is why the drainage channel," Lars said, pointing to the trench, "and why I leave air gaps between the planks, and why the entrance will not be sealed, just covered with canvas that can move. Air will flow." James looked doubtful. "Air flows upward when it's warm. In winter, cold air sinks. You'll have a pocket of cold, damp air sitting right on top of your firewood." "In Norway," Lars began. "This isn't Norway," Robert interrupted, not unkindly. "The cold here is different, drier. That's what saves us, the dryness. You start creating a damp environment underground. You're fighting against the one advantage we have." They were not trying to discourage him out of meanness. Lars could see that. They were concerned, the way experienced men become concerned when they see someone new making what appears to be a fundamental error in judgment that could prove fatal. They helped him position 2 more beams before they left, and as they rode away, he heard Robert say to his brother, "Should we tell him to stop?" And James reply, "He's a grown man, he'll figure it out," which meant they expected him to fail, to recognize his error, and to abandon the project in favor of conventional methods. Lars went back to work. By October 8th, the roof structure was complete, and he had begun covering it. The 12 beams spanned the pit at 18-inch intervals, creating a framework that felt solid when he climbed on it to test the strength. The planks laid across them perpendicular, and he had deliberately left quarter-inch gaps between each plank to allow air movement exactly as he had told the Hendricks brothers. Over the planks, he placed the split pine pieces in a tight layer, bark side up where possible, creating what amounted to a wooden membrane over the entire structure. Then came the canvas tarp, a heavy 12-ounce material that had covered his family's haystacks in Lillehammer for 15 years before he had carefully folded it and packed it for America. It was approximately 20 feet by 30 feet, large enough to cover the entire roof structure and drape down the sides, which he secured with stones. Finally came the soil, which he began shoveling back into place on October 9th. This was the most physically demanding part of the entire project because the pile of excavated earth had settled and compacted and now had to be moved shovelful by shovelful back onto the structure. He worked steadily for 6 days, building up a layer of earth over the canvas that eventually measured 24 inches at the thinnest point and nearly 3 feet at the center, where the slight dome shape he had created would shed water. By October 15th, the structure was covered and looked like a low earthen mound behind his barn, approximately 18 feet long and 16 feet wide, with the sloped entrance ramp descending on the south side. The entire surface was raw dirt, but he scattered grass seed over it, knowing that by spring it would be growing and the roots would help hold everything in place. Thomas McKendrick rode by on October 16th, stopped, and stared at the mound. "You buried it," he said. "Yes," Lars replied. "All that work, all that timber, all that firewood, and you buried it in the ground." "Yes." McKendrick shook his head slowly. "Son, I've seen a lot of foolishness on the frontier. I've seen people try things that made no sense, and I've seen most of them learn hard lessons. But this might be the most expensive mistake I've witnessed. You've got good firewood in there, dry firewood presumably, and you've put it underground, where it's going to absorb moisture from the soil and the air and turn into punky, useless rot by Christmas." "I do not think that will happen," Lars said quietly. "You don't think," McKendrick said. "Well, thinking's fine, but Winter doesn't care what you think. Winter cares about what is. And what is that you're going to run out of burnable wood sometime in January, and you're going to freeze, or you're going to have to swallow your pride and ask for help. And I want you to know right now that when that happens, we'll help you. We're not going to let you die over stubbornness, but you're going to have to ask." "I will remember that," Lars said, and McKendrick rode away satisfied that he had done his duty in offering advanced charity to a fool. The entrance to the underground shed required its own careful construction, and Lars devoted the final week of October to completing it properly. The sloped ramp descended 8 feet over a horizontal distance of 12 feet, which created a gentle enough angle that he could walk down comfortably even in ice. He framed the sides of this ramp with vertical posts every 4 feet, then attached horizontal rails between them, creating a corridor approximately 4 feet wide. Over this corridor, he built a simple peaked roof using more of the pine planks, angled to shed snow and rain, away from the entrance. The roof extended 3 feet beyond the top of the ramp, creating a covered platform at ground level. At the bottom of the ramp, the entrance to the storage chamber itself was simply an opening in the earth. No door, no seal, exactly as he had planned. The airflow would move through this opening, through the chamber, and out through the small gaps he had left between the roof planks. On October 28th, he began moving firewood into the structure, and this was when the design proved its practical value in ways he had hoped for but had not been certain of until he experienced it directly. He could load his small handcart with wood at the woodpile where he was processing the logs he had purchased, wheel it to the entrance of the underground shed, roll it down the gentle ramp, and stack the wood inside without ever lifting more than 1 or 2 pieces at a time. The physical effort was substantially less than throwing wood into a conventional elevated shed, and the entire process felt efficient in a way that satisfied something deep in his Norwegian appreciation for well-designed work. The interior of the chamber was dark, but not uncomfortable, and he had placed 4 candle lanterns on wall-mounted shelves that provided adequate light for stacking. The temperature inside, even in late October, was noticeably warmer than the outside air. He had no thermometer to measure precisely, but his hands, which went numb quickly in the October wind outside, remained comfortable inside the chamber, even without gloves. By November 3rd, he had the structure completely filled with firewood, stacked in rows with careful attention to air circulation between the pieces. He estimated he had approximately 9 cords stored, which was more than he calculated he would need for the winter, but less than the space could hold if he had packed it tightly. He left room to move, to access wood from different areas, to allow air to circulate throughout. Mary Catherine Brennan stopped by on November 5th with her brother Seamus, who wanted to see the structure he had heard about. Lars walked them down the ramp and into the chamber, and they stood in the lamplight looking at the organized rows of split pine and the earthen walls and the darkness above where the roof structure was invisible. "I'll grant you this," Seamus said. "It's impressive work. The engineering is solid, but Mary's right about the moisture question. You've got earth walls, earth floor, and come spring thaw, this whole thing might turn into a mud pit with your firewood swimming in it." "The floor is above the water table," Lars said. "I dug until I reached hard clay, then stopped. The drainage channel will carry away any water that seeps in." "Might," Seamus said, "might carry it away, or might freeze solid in December and turn into a dam." These were reasonable concerns, Lars thought. These were not people mocking him out of cruelty or ignorance, but people who knew this land and its weather and were genuinely trying to warn him about dangers they had learned through experience. The problem was, their experience was with conventional methods applied to Montana conditions, and he was attempting something unconventional based on different conditions that he believed operated on the same principles. One of them was wrong, and winter would prove which. The first significant snow came on November 12th, dropping 6 inches overnight and covering the landscape in white that turned the brown prairie into something that reminded Lars achingly of Norway. The temperature dropped to 18 degrees, and he began burning firewood steadily to keep his cabin comfortable. His routine became established quickly. Twice a day, morning and evening, he would walk from his cabin to the entrance of the underground shed, descend the ramp, load his cart with enough wood for the next 12 hours, and wheel it back to the cabin. The entire process took approximately 10 minutes and required no digging, no uncovering, no clearing of snow. The wood he retrieved was dry to the touch, cold but not frozen, and burned cleanly with minimal smoke. Meanwhile, his neighbors were following the conventional approach of keeping their firewood in above-ground structures, sheds, covered piles, or simple stacks near the house, and accessing it by wading through increasing snow or clearing paths that had to be re-cleared after every storm. On November 18th, the temperature dropped to 4 below zero and stayed there for 3 days. Lars burned through approximately 1 cord during that period, and each time he descended into the underground chamber, he noted with satisfaction that the temperature inside remained notably warmer than outside. His breath still fogged in the air, but his fingers did not go numb, and the wood showed no signs of moisture accumulation. On November 22nd, Thomas McKendrick's son, Daniel, 28, stopped by to borrow a shovel and mentioned that they were having trouble with snow drifting against their woodshed and blocking the door. "Every time we shovel it clear, the wind just piles it up again," Daniel said. "Takes an hour of work before we can even get to the wood, and by the time we're done, we're so tired we can barely carry it back to the house." Lars nodded sympathetically. "You are welcome to see my storage," he offered. Daniel hesitated, then agreed, and Lars walked him to the entrance and down the ramp. Daniel stood in the chamber looking around, and Lars could see him calculating, reconsidering, beginning to understand. "Your father thinks this will not work," Lars said. "My father thought the railroad wouldn't reach Montana either," Daniel replied. "He's a good man, but he's not always right. This is clever. I'll admit it, this is clever." "You could tell him that," Lars suggested. Daniel laughed. "I could, but I won't. Let him figure it out himself when you make it through the winter, and he's been breaking his back digging out the woodshed after every storm." Daniel left, and Lars suspected that conversation would eventually reach the elder McKendrick, whether Daniel intended it to or not, because word spreads on the frontier through the simple mechanism of people talking about anything interesting enough to mention, and a Norwegian's underground firewood storage was definitely interesting enough to mention. December arrived with temperatures that established a pattern of cold that felt personal in its intensity. Single digits became normal, below zero became common, and twice the temperature dropped below 20 below. Lars's cabin, which was well chinked and carefully built, stayed comfortable as long as he maintained the fire, which he did with wood that remained consistently dry and accessible. The underground storage was working exactly as he had hoped, which should have been satisfying, but instead created a strange anxiety because the real test had not yet come. He knew Montana winters, knew them by reputation, and from the stories he had heard in Helena, and he knew that what he had experienced so far was preliminary. The serious cold, the dangerous cold, the kind of cold that killed cattle and froze men in their beds, that was still ahead. On December 14th, he walked to Mary Catherine Brennan's homestead to check on her, as he had promised her brother he would do periodically. She was fine, managing, but when he mentioned his firewood storage, she shook her head. "I'm glad it's working for you so far," she said, "but you haven't seen a real Montana blizzard yet. When that comes, and it will come, you'll understand why we build our woodsheds close to the house. When you can't see 3 feet in front of you and the wind is strong enough to knock you down, you need your firewood as close as possible. Your shed is 40 yards from your cabin. That might as well be 40 miles in a whiteout." "I have rope," Lars said. "I will string rope from the cabin to the entrance, if that becomes necessary." "Rope can break. Rope can get buried. Rope can freeze to the point where you can't grip it with gloves, and you can't grip it without gloves because your hands will freeze in seconds." She was not being argumentative, just stating facts that she had learned. "I appreciate your concern," Lars said, "but I think it will work." "I hope it does," she said, and meant it. "I truly hope it does, because if it doesn't, you'll be in serious trouble very quickly." If this account of forgotten practical wisdom resonates with you, if you value stories about ingenuity and adaptation that deserve to be remembered, I would be grateful if you would subscribe to this channel and like this video. These stories survive only when people choose to preserve them, and your engagement directly helps keep these accounts available for others who might need to hear them. The algorithm that determines what gets seen and what disappears cares only about measurable interest, and every subscription, every like, every share is a measurable vote that this kind of knowledge matters. I am not asking for myself, but for the collective project of remembering how people solved real problems with careful thought and available materials, because that skill remains valuable regardless of era. The blizzard that would validate or condemn Lars Eriksson's entire approach began on the afternoon of January 7th, 1884, with a temperature of 12 degrees and a wind that came from the north carrying the smell of something vast and cold. By 6 p.m., the snow was falling heavily, and by 9 p.m., the wind had increased to the point where it screamed around the corners of Lars's cabin with a sound like something alive and furious. The temperature dropped to 0 by 10 p.m., then to 8 below by midnight, then to 15 below by 2 a.m. Lars had lived through serious storms in Norway, but this was different in quality. The wind was stronger, more sustained, more willing to find every gap and crack in the cabin's construction and exploit it. He maintained the fire carefully, burning through wood faster than he had planned, and by 4 a.m., he realized he would need to restock before dawn. He dressed in every layer he owned, lit a lantern, and opened the cabin door into a world that had erased itself. The snow was not falling so much as moving horizontally, and the wind hit him with enough force that he staggered backward. Visibility was effectively zero, just white movement and darkness. He had strung the rope 3 days earlier, looping it from a post beside his cabin door to a post at the entrance to the underground shed, and now he gripped it with both hands and began pulling himself along it. The distance was 40 yards, approximately 120 feet, and it took him nearly 10 minutes to cover it because the wind kept trying to knock him sideways and the snow had drifted across his path in places deep enough that he was wading thigh-deep. But the rope held, and he followed it to the covered entrance of the shed, and then he was descending the ramp, and the wind noise diminished and finally stopped as he reached the bottom and stepped into the storage chamber. He stood there for a long moment, breathing hard, his face numb, his hands aching even inside thick gloves. The temperature in the chamber was cold, but nothing like outside. He estimated perhaps 20 degrees, possibly warmer. He could breathe normally, could move his fingers, could see by lantern light the rows of stacked firewood, exactly as he had left them, dry and ready. He loaded his cart with enough wood to last through the next day, covered it with a canvas tarp to keep the snow off during the return journey, and began the trip back to the cabin. It was harder with the loaded cart, much harder, and twice the wind nearly ripped the rope from his grip, but he made it, hauled the cart inside, and closed the door against the storm that continued without pause for the next 38 hours. The temperature during the blizzard reached a low of 27 degrees below zero at approximately 9 a.m. on January 8th, and it stayed below zero continuously for 63 hours. The snow accumulated to a depth of 41 inches on level ground and significantly more where it drifted, which was nearly everywhere because the wind never stopped long enough for the snow to settle in place. Lars made 3 trips to the underground shed during the storm, each one difficult, each one successful, and each time he noted that inside the storage chamber, the conditions remained essentially unchanged. Cold, but not dangerously so, dry, accessible, with the firewood in perfect condition. His cabin stayed warm, he stayed fed and rested, and when the storm finally ended on the afternoon of January 9th and the sky cleared to reveal a landscape transformed into white dunes and ridges, he was tired but fine, completely fine, with approximately 7 cords of firewood still in storage. The same could not be said for his neighbors. Thomas McKendrick's woodshed, which was a conventional structure 8 feet from his house, had been completely buried under a drift that peaked at nearly 6 feet high. The McKendricks had managed to dig through to the door on the second day of the storm, but the effort had exhausted both Thomas and Daniel to the point where they had burned through their accessible wood faster than planned because they were too tired to moderate the fire carefully. They survived, but it was closer than they wanted to admit. The Hendricks brothers lost access to their woodshed entirely when the door froze shut and the drift became too large to clear, and they ended up burning fence posts and furniture to keep from freezing. Mary Catherine Brennan fared better because her woodshed was attached to her house with an interior door, but the snow had found ways through gaps in the roof and walls, and a significant portion of her wood was now wet and difficult to burn, producing smoke that filled her cabin and made her cough for days afterward. Exactly 4 miles to the east, a homesteader named Carl Voss, 43, who had been in the territory only 8 months, ran out of accessible firewood on the 3rd day of the storm and tried to reach his woodpile behind his barn. He became disoriented in the whiteout, wandered off course, and was found 2 days later frozen to death 30 yards from his front door. His woodpile was intact, covered with snow, but perfectly reachable if he had simply been able to find it. This was the brutal mathematics of frontier winter. What worked kept you alive, what failed killed you, and there was no partial credit for effort. On January 12th, Thomas McKendrick rode to Lars's homestead, his face raw from windburn, his horse moving carefully through snow that in places was still chest deep. He found Lars outside the entrance to the underground shed, descending the ramp with his cart to retrieve more wood. McKendrick dismounted and stood there silently for a long moment. "I was wrong," he finally said. Lars paused, surprised not by the admission, but by the directness of it. "About what specifically?" Lars asked, because he was genuinely unsure which element McKendrick was referencing. "All of it," McKendrick said. "The storage, the design, the whole thing. I thought you were building yourself a pretty grave, and instead, you built something that works better than anything I've seen in 7 winters here." He gestured at the entrance, at the ramp that was clear of snow, except for a light coating that had blown in. "We spent hours digging to reach our wood. Hours. And you just walk down a ramp like you're going to a root cellar." "It is essentially the same principle as a root cellar," Lars said, "but for firewood instead of potatoes." "I called you a fool," McKendrick said. "Didn't say it to your face, but I said it to others, and I was wrong to do that. You're not a fool. You're smarter than the rest of us." Lars shook his head. "Not smarter. I only remembered something from Norway and tried it here. Maybe I was lucky that it worked." "That's not luck talking," McKendrick said. "That's just mathematics. Your wood stayed dry. Your wood stayed accessible. You stayed warm, and you weren't exhausted from fighting through drifts twice a day. That's not luck. That's engineering." He paused, then asked, "Would you be willing to show me exactly how you built it? I'm thinking about constructing something similar before next winter." "I would be happy to show you," Lars said, and meant it, because knowledge that saves lives is knowledge worth sharing, regardless of whether anyone remembers where it came from. By the end of January, Daniel McKendrick and Seamus Brennan had both visited the underground shed and asked detailed questions about its construction. By mid-February, James Hendricks had begun excavating his own version, slightly smaller than Lars's, but using the same basic design. By March, when a traveling correspondent from the Helena Weekly Herald passed through the area, gathering stories about how homesteaders had survived the January blizzard, he noted in his March 19th dispatch that several families were constructing Norwegian-style underground firewood storage chambers that proved remarkably effective during recent severe weather. The correspondent did not mention Lars Eriksson by name, and Lars did not correct this omission, because the point was never recognition but survival, and if people were adopting a method that worked, that was sufficient. The second winter, 1884 to 1885, was milder than the first, but 7 families within 15 miles of Lars's homestead had constructed their own versions of underground firewood storage by October, and all of them reported the same advantages: dry wood, easy access during storms, less physical strain, and a notable fuel efficiency because the wood burned cleaner when it was consistently dry. Thomas McKendrick's version was larger than Lars's, a full 20 feet by 20 feet, and he had improved on the drainage system by installing a clay pipe that carried water away more effectively than an open trench. Mary Catherine Brennan built hers with help from her brother and the Hendricks brothers, and she added a refinement that several others subsequently adopted. She extended the entrance ramp an additional 8 feet and installed a door at ground level, creating an enclosed corridor that provided even more wind protection. The modifications and improvements were exactly what Lars had hoped would happen, because a good idea should evolve as different people adapt it to their specific needs, and the collective wisdom of multiple builders almost always exceeds the individual insight of the original designer. By 1886, underground firewood storage had become common enough in that part of Fergus County that newcomers simply built them as a matter of course, assuming this was standard Montana practice rather than a Norwegian innovation introduced by one man 3 years earlier. The origin story began to fade, which is what happens to most practical innovations. They stop being remarkable and start being obvious, and the person who first demonstrated their value becomes irrelevant to the technique's continued use. Lars Eriksson never complained about this, never made any effort to claim credit or ensure his contribution was remembered, because he had accomplished exactly what he set out to do. He had survived Montana winters using methods he knew were effective, and those methods had spread to others who benefited from them. That was the entire point. The firewood stayed dry, the families stayed warm, and the number of people who died or suffered serious cold-related injuries in that particular region during subsequent severe winters was measurably lower than in comparable areas where conventional above-ground storage remained standard. The mathematics were simple enough. Dry wood burns more efficiently than wet wood, accessible wood can be used more reliably than inaccessible wood, and consistent access to fuel during extreme weather directly correlates with survival rates. This is not sentiment or theory, but documented reality that can be verified through mortality records and newspaper accounts of the period. If you appreciate stories like this one, accounts of practical problem solving that produced measurable improvements in survival and quality of life, I encourage you to like this video and share it with others who value this kind of historical knowledge. The work of researching and presenting these accounts takes considerable time and effort, and the support of viewers who find value in them makes it possible to continue. These are not entertainment for its own sake, but documentation of how people thought carefully about serious problems and developed solutions that worked well enough to be adopted by others, which is a pattern worth studying, regardless of whether you personally will ever need to store firewood in Montana. The principles translate. What works is what endures. Innovation often comes from adapting old knowledge to new circumstances, and skepticism based on convention is not the same as skepticism based on evidence. Lars Eriksson proved his homestead in 1888, received full title to his 160 acres, and continued improving his operation with the same methodical care he had brought to the firewood storage. He married in 1889, a widow named Ingrid Peterson, who had emigrated from Sweden and who brought 3 children to the marriage, and together they expanded the homestead, added a larger barn, and eventually ran a small but successful cattle operation that lasted until Lars's death in 1921 at age 72. His obituary in the Lewistown Democrat News on April 7, 1921, mentioned his service to the community, his reputation for careful farm management, and his survival of the brutal winter of 1884, but it made no reference to the underground firewood storage that had enabled that survival and subsequently spread across the region. By 1921, such storage was simply what people did if they had space and resources to build it, and no one thought to mention it as remarkable any more than they would mention that he had used a barn for his animals or a well for his water. The structure itself remained in use on the original homestead until 1947, when the property was sold to a rancher who filled in the chamber and leveled the site to create more pasture space. There was no marker, no recognition, no preservation effort, because by 1947 the innovation had been superseded by other methods: propane heating, better insulation, improved transportation that made fuel delivery reliable even in winter. The underground shed had served its purpose for 63 years and then vanished, leaving behind only a slight depression in the earth that was invisible within 2 growing seasons. The modern parallel is visible in contemporary sustainable architecture, where the principle of earth-sheltered storage has been rediscovered, rebranded as geothermal mass storage or passive ground temperature regulation, and applied to everything from wine cellars to data centers. The physics are identical to what Lars Ericsson applied in 1883. Earth temperature below the frost line remains relatively constant year-round, providing free insulation that requires no energy input and no mechanical systems. Engineers and architects now present this as innovative green technology, often apparently unaware that frontier homesteaders were using the same principles more than a century ago out of simple necessity and observation. A 2019 study by the National Renewable Energy Laboratory confirmed that earth-sheltered storage can reduce energy costs for temperature-sensitive materials by 40 to 60% compared to conventional above-ground structures in climates with significant seasonal variation, which is another way of saying what Thomas McKendrick learned in January 1884. Lars's wood stayed dry without effort, while everyone else's required constant work and still got wet. The technology has not changed because the physics have not changed. What has changed is our collective memory of who figured this out and why, and our tendency to believe that solutions requiring no electricity or complex equipment must be primitive rather than elegant. An underground firewood storage chamber built properly is not primitive. It is sophisticated in exactly the way that matters, which is that it solves the problem completely using available materials and basic principles that remain true regardless of historical period or technological advancement. The broader lesson, if one is needed, is that innovation often consists of remembering rather than inventing, and that wisdom about survival and efficiency tends to be discovered repeatedly by different people in different places who are all responding to the same fundamental constraints of physics, weather, and human limitation. Lars Ericsson did not invent underground storage. His grandfather used it, his grandfather's grandfather probably used it, and people in cold climates across Europe and Asia had been using variations of it for centuries. What Lars did was recognize that the principle was portable, that Montana cold was not fundamentally different from Norwegian cold in ways that mattered to firewood storage, and that conventional American frontier wisdom about woodsheds was optimized for different conditions than the ones he was facing. He was willing to be mocked, willing to work alone, willing to trust his own analysis over the collective judgment of more experienced neighbors, and willing to be proven wrong if the experiment failed. It succeeded, and the success spread, and within a few years it had become invisible through the simple mechanism of acceptance. That pattern, individual innovation, community skepticism, empirical validation through crisis, rapid adoption, eventual invisibility, is so common in frontier history that it constitutes almost a natural law of knowledge transfer. The crisis is essential because it provides undeniable evidence that cuts through argument and tradition and forces everyone to acknowledge what actually works versus what they thought would work. The blizzard of January 1884 was that crisis for Lars Ericsson's underground shed, and it performed the same function that severe weather has always performed on the frontier. It sorted truth from opinion with brutal efficiency and no patience for ego or convention. The shed that neighbors laughed at in September looked strange and unnecessary and even foolish, right up until the moment when the temperature dropped to 27 below zero and the wind piled snow 6 feet deep against every above-ground structure in Fergus County. Then it looked like exactly what it was, a carefully engineered solution to a specific problem, built by someone who understood that survival depends not on doing what everyone else does, but on doing what actually works when conditions become extreme. Lars's firewood stayed dry through the blizzard, stayed accessible through the whiteout, stayed ready to burn cleanly and efficiently, while his neighbors fought through exhaustion and risk to reach wood that was often wet and always harder to access. The mathematics were simple, the physics were unchanging, and the outcome was exactly what he had calculated it would be. The neighbors stopped laughing and started measuring, which is precisely what happens when theory meets reality and reality wins. That transformation from mockery to adoption, from skepticism to replication, is not just vindication for one Norwegian homesteader in 1884 Montana. It is the fundamental mechanism through which practical wisdom spreads and survives, one crisis and one convert at a time, until the innovation becomes invisible and the origin story fades, and all that remains is the quiet evidence that people stayed warm, stayed safe, and stayed alive through winters that killed those who refused to adapt.